Yes.
When we get the house, are you still gonna come over?
Definitely try and arrange it. Do you know when it might be?
Oh, maybe next week, maybe, or the first week of June, or maybe the second.
Okay, well, keep me posted.
Okay, and how much does that? What do you call it?
The mezuzah.
How much does that cost?
Mezuzah.
How much that cost?
The mezuzah itself, the box, you can buy all sorts of different ones. The scroll, I have to check with our sisterhood to see what the gift shop charges for them.
Okay, then you let us know.
I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
Not at all. It's nice to know that some parts of life are still going on.
Yeah, but we're going crazy with this house, but we're trying because we're paying too much rent here. I told you we're paying almost 17 here.
Yeah.
And we might as well try and get something that we can own and pay less. You understand?
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So let's see what happens. I'm leaving everything in his hands. Whatever he says is good for me. You know? So let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. So I will let you know, and we'll pay all the expenses for the gas and whatever. It's not around here. Huh?
Don't worry about that.
It's not around here. It's very far.
Where are you moving to?
Volusia. That's on DeBerry.
Oh yeah, I know Volusia, DeBerry, yeah.
Yeah, because my two daughters live there, so that's why they got me this house near them.
Ah, it's good to be close to your family.
Yeah, they want to keep an eye on us. We're getting too old, so they gotta watch us. Okay, Rabbi, we'll let you know. Thank you so much.
No problem. Why is my video not working?
Okay.
Just a second. There we go. Now we'll just wait for the other attendees.
No problem.
See, we've got a number of people on the Facebook. If you're coming in through Facebook, please feel free to, if you're coming in through YouTube, please feel free to send a quick text just so I know you're there. And remember that you can send in questions or comments at any time. We'll give it just a few more minutes. I want to start as close to on time as possible today because I have a meeting at 7. So hold on a second. Yes, the link. Just a second. Where is the link? Just a moment. There's the Zoom link, and the handout link is coming next. All right, that's a few more people linked in. By the way, for those of you that are using the link for the Zoom, it is the same link each week. So if you just save that somewhere, then you'll always be able to get into the class.
Okay.
All right, well, like I said, we've got a lot of ground to cover and I have a meeting at 7, so I don't want to go over if I can avoid it. So let's go ahead and get going. Last week, we talked about the different denominations in Judaism, about the conservative movement, the Reform, the Orthodox movements, and others. And as I explained, they are extensions of the answer of what do we do in the modern world? That all of the movements were essentially trying to answer that question. The Reform movement in the 1800s, again, there's been a lot of changes there, but in the 1800s said, let's embrace it and shed as much of Judaism as we feel like. The Orthodox movement said, no, we need to resist the modern world as much as possible and isolate in any way we can. And the conservative movement said, we need to try and continue the process of living in the contemporary world that we always have, but we know it's going to be hard because the modern world is changing so fast. What I didn't say last week is that there was a fourth movement that began during this same time period. And this movement is what is usually referred to as Zionism. But instead of being a religious movement, it was a political movement. It was a social movement. And that social movement in the 1800s is what eventually leads to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 as a modern country. So what we're going to look at tonight is that story of how we went from the middle of the 1800s to 1948, how we went from having no autonomy and independence in Israel to having our own country there. And in another class, we will look at what happened from 1948 until the present. So this is just getting us up to 1948 and how things looked at that time. Good, good. So first things first, I have to point out, even though the establishment of the new state of Israel in 1948 is going to be our focus, and even though we're going to talk about the hundreds of thousands of people that immigrated to the land, there were Jews living there the entire time. As I mentioned in the history class earlier, we had a great deal of difficulty after the Roman destruction, but there were always Jews living there. As it says in Psalm 137, and showing that our heart has always been there, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory at my happiest hour. We have always had a connection to Jerusalem, always had a connection to Israel. Those who left, of course, but there were Jews who remained. There were Jews who returned with that passion after the Babylonian exile. There are Jews who resisted the Roman occupation with that same strength. There were Jews who held on during the Roman occupation despite the persecution, and who continued despite famines and droughts and religious and ethnic persecutions under the Byzantine, which was the Roman and then Catholic form, the Muslims, the Crusaders, Muslims again, and then the Ottoman empires. There were always some Jews who continued to live in the land of Israel during all of these different eras and problems. But life was never easy for them in those communities. So they were always a minority of the Jews in the world following the Roman occupation. So we then have to ask, why did Jews leave in large numbers? Well, mainly because of very practical reasons. If you were still living in Israel during the Roman times, and then again in the later empires that took over, there was heavy taxation against Jews. Now, people nowadays talk about taxation of 30% being bad. But we're talking about taxation that was breaking the average poor people. So that they didn't have enough money for even food for themselves or enough money to hold on to their farms and land. And a person who lost all of that would often think that maybe leaving the country that was being handled so badly would lead to a better life. Of course, they were also persecuted on and off again in many different eras for living Jewishly. If you can't have your synagogues, if you can't have your Torah study, if you can't follow your rituals of circumcision or of Shabbat, at a certain point, if you want to live Jewishly without being constantly harassed, you want to find a different place to live. It is sad that the land of Israel was often the least easy place for a Jew to live, but for much of the last 2,000 years, that was the case. There was also the problem that many of the people who lived in this era over the last 2,000 years were always very eager to take new slaves, sometimes through debt collection, sometimes through outright capture. And so living in Israel could end up in slavery. And those who were made slaves were often shipped off to other parts of the world. And if they were able to be ransomed or to find their way to freedom, they would often end up staying in those new parts of the world. And of course, it was simply attractive for many people who had a choice to leave Israel, because many of the communities that were established by Jews before the Roman occupation and destruction, they were doing quite well. This is especially true of the communities that were still in Babylon, which is where many Jews went, but also in Egypt and some parts of Europe. There were communities that were established during the Roman times. And as Israel became harder and harder to live in, many people decided to go and join these other communities, whether they be further to the east in what is now modern day Iraq, or up into Asia Minor in what is now Turkey, or over into Greece, or throughout southern Europe of Italy and France and parts of Germany, or into Egypt and across North Africa. Jews were able to go where life was better. But there was never a mass exodus from Israel. It wasn't like all the Jews simply said, all right, everybody on the boat, we're leaving, and just emptied the country. There was always a Jewish population that still lived in Israel through the good times, which weren't many, and through the bad, which was the much larger percentage. So in the long run, those communities were able to hold on, but they didn't exactly grow. There would be people dying and people born in about equal number. And so the communities just were able to barely survive, but not much. Whereas the communities that went into the Babylonian areas and the communities that went into Europe and North Africa, by comparison, they thrived. They were very successful for the size that they were, and in comparison to Israel itself. So that meant that we now have a large portion of Jews living around the world, in fact, a huge majority compared to those who live in Israel. But we never forgot Israel. As I mentioned last week when we talked about the Reform movement in the 1800s, one of the sticking points among the anti-Semites and nationalists of Europe was that Jews were still longing for a return to the land of Israel. And that is simply the case. That was true. We always wanted to go back. So when was that supposed to happen? There were many people who, for many centuries, basically advocated that we not go back. But they would point to the verse from Psalms and say, unless the Lord build the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman keeps vigil in vain. The implication being that unless God was actually going to support our rebuilding of the land of Israel, then there was no point going back to build up. And indeed, there are still some rabbis from the modern era, the Satmar Rebbe, or Teitelbaum being one, who continue to believe that the modern state of Israel is incorrect. As I talked about last week, that the early Orthodox groups did not believe in what Zionism was trying to do. As Rabbi Teitelbaum would argue, even if the members of the Knesset, that's the current Israeli government, their parliament, were righteous and holy, he does not think they are, it is a terrible and often criminal iniquity to seize redemption and rule before the time has come. So this belief used to be much more common. It's still around, but it was very, very common in the 1800s and in the centuries before to believe that Jews should not be moving as a movement. We should not be going as a group to the land of Israel to reestablish, but instead that we should wait for Mashiach. We should wait for the Messiah. As it says in the Talmud, as Rav Yehuda said, anyone who ascends from Babylonia to Eretz Israel transgresses a positive mitzvah. Babylonia being the area of Iraq and also Persia in this context. As it is stated, they shall be taken to Babylon, and there they shall remain until the day that I recall them, said the Lord, taken from Jeremiah. Now, and Rabbi Zerah, what did he say about this? That verse is written about the temple service vessels, and it does not refer to the Jewish people. As the previous verse states, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that remain in the house of the Lord. So there was a debate in the period of the Talmud about whether or not people were allowed to go up to the land of Israel in order to resettle it. Some said no, that we had to wait for the Messiah. Some said no, that is not applicable. I got a quick question in the Zoom chat. Was that the reason that the Reform movement did not support at the time the concept of the state of Israel? No. The Reform movement had a different reason for not supporting the establishment of the state of Israel. The explanations I'm giving are what the Orthodox said. The Reform believed that establishing the state of Israel would further antagonize their host countries, that the nations of Europe in particular would see that those who were trying to build up Israel would be traitors to European nations, and that the Jews who remained would now be considered suspect in the eyes of the nations of Europe. I should point out that they were kind of right. That is to say that even now in the 21st century, there are, as I mentioned during the class on anti-Semitism, there are many people and many governments that do view their own Jews with suspicion, as though they might have dual loyalty with the state of Israel. So for both those reasons, the Reform were opposed to it and the Orthodox were opposed to it in the 1800s. There was another idea of not going up as a wall, of going up as a group. Even if an individual could go, that a group should not go. As there was taught, why are these three oaths, oaths taken from the Song of Songs, the verses here on the slide, needed? One, so that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, as a wall. And another one, that the Holy One, blessed be he, adjured, made us swear, that the Jews should not rebel against the rule of the nations of the world, meaning that we should stop having all our revolutions because it just continued to get us killed. And the last one is that the Holy One, blessed be he, adjured, made us swear that the nations of the world, that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively. There was an idea that there was sort of a holding pattern. They wouldn't treat us too badly, we wouldn't rebel against them, and we wouldn't try to reestablish Israel until the Messiah came. Obviously, many people in the 1800s begin to see this deal as breaking down. The nations of the world are no longer holding up their part of the bargain. But before we get to that, why did we begin to come back in large numbers? Well, first of all, halakhically, it is possible for people to move to Israel. In fact, that was one thing that was considered to be within the prerogative of a household leader, right? That a household leader could force the household to go up to the land of Israel, but could not force them to leave. And indeed, we see throughout history many stories of many Jews, Maimonides and Nachmanides as two very famous examples, who moved to the land of Israel. Nachmanides stayed, Rambam, on the other hand, found the community too difficult to live in. It was too poor and unable to support learning, and so ended up moving down to the Egyptian community. So it was always a possibility historically. But in the Enlightenment period, especially the 1800s, this was when things really began to pick up. And part of that was because just as other nations of Europe and other peoples in Europe began to embrace the idea of self-determination, so too the Jews living in Europe also said, well, wait a minute, if the Italians and the Germans and the Czechs and the Slavs and the French, if they all get to have their country, why don't we get to have our country? It was part of the zeitgeist, the thinking of the time. But really, what was perhaps the most powerful motivator was the rising anti-Semitism in Europe, beginning in the middle of the 1800s, but then continuing to escalate, especially as far as Zionism is concerned, with the pogroms in Russia in the 1880s. Many more Jews began to realize that Europe was not a safe place to be if you were a Jew. This was debated, but the number of Jews who were being killed continued to escalate during this time period. Most notably, Theodor Herzl, who is considered to be the father of Zionism, became to this position because he watched the anti-Semitism against Dreyfus in France and realized that there was deep-seated hatred of the Jews, and that the only way in his mind that that could be removed would be for Jews to remove themselves and establish their own country. Then we would be normalized like other nations. Okay, there we go. Let me just get back up the other thing. So this begins a period then in 1882 of what's called the first Aliyah. Now, Aliyah means literally going up, and ever since the ancient days, when somebody goes to Israel, it is considered making Aliyah, it is considered going up. I don't care if you're flying in from Mount Everest, Israel is considered to be the high point, you're ascending to Israel. This term Aliyah, by the way, is the word that's still used when a person is called to the Torah during services. So the idea was for the Jews to return to their countries of origin once everything was normalized. No, that's not actually what Herzl believed. What Herzl argued was that if the Jews had their own country, then the Jews living in other countries would be treated better as well. The same way that a French person living in Germany or a German person living in France was not treated with the same deep-seated hatred and suspicion as Jews were. He thought, he was wrong, he thought that if there was a Jewish state, that the Jews living in other countries would then be treated just like any other expat who happened to be living in another state. It turns out that anti-Semitism is a little bit more durable than he thought, but that was his hypothesis. So during this first wave, beginning in around 1882, you get about 35,000 immigrants coming. Mostly they are from Russia and Romania, where the persecutions have been especially bad at that time. And mostly this group is buying small parcels of land from the Ottoman, that is to say, Turkish landowners. I don't know how well you remember your world history, but during this time, the entire area of this portion of the Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Empire and had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that meant that the people who owned the land in Israel didn't usually live in Israel. Most of them lived up in what is now modern day Turkey. And so Jews would buy the land from these Turkish landowners and then would move into the territory of what would become the modern state of Israel and set up their farms, set up their shops, set up whole villages that they would establish as groups. Now, the local residents, that is to say, the people who had lived in those areas that the Jews were now buying, they were often upset. Many of them were what are called sharecroppers or tenant farmers, meaning they didn't own the land. It was owned by people in Turkey, but they and often their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had been working that same piece of land and sending the agricultural value, the money that was made or the actual produce to the owner of the land as the payment. That was their rent. When the Jews purchased it, they did not want the current residents, who would eventually be called Palestinians, they did not want them to continue working it because the Jews wanted to work the land themselves. So this caused displacement of many of the people who had lived there. It also caused a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. Now, unfortunately, the anger was not directed at the people selling the property in Turkey. It was directed at the person buying the property, which is to say, it was directed at these European Jews who were coming in. So in 1897, as this period of the first Aliyah is underway, Theodor Herzl, who I mentioned is considered the father of Zionism, convened and helped lead what was called the first Zionist Congress. And at this time, they focused on putting together an official political platform. What was their goal? What was their agenda? And so this is the official declaration from that time. Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. Palestine was the name of this territory as it had been given by the Romans and was just used generically. There was not a separate country of Palestine at any point. There was never an actual Palestinian state that was separate from being just an administrative district of one or another of the empires. For the attainment of this purpose, the Congress considers the following means serviceable. This is our plan. The promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artists, and tradesmen in Palestine. They want to send farmers and they want to send people who can work. The federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of various countries. If you've ever wondered why we have a federation in Orlando and why there is a federation in every city that has a reasonable Jewish population, it is because that was part of what was being advocated by Zionism. And Jewish federations around the world continue to be very important supporters, not only of their local communities, but also of Israel. They also advocated the strengthening of the Jewish feeling and consciousness to try and reinvigorate this idea. Most importantly, they weren't advocating that this be only a religious consciousness, but that this be a national and shared identity consciousness. And also preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose, which is very fancy diplomat talk for saying we need other governments to actually support us if we want to become a country. If you're trying to make a country out of a piece of land in someone else's country, the Ottoman Empire, then you're going to need support from other people to make that work. You're going to need support from other governments. And so they began to lobby governments around the world for support. It was also at this time that Hatikva was adopted as the national anthem. The second Aliyah, the second wave, begins around 1904 and continues to 1914. No surprise, it is coming to a conclusion with World War I. This again saw about 40,000 immigrants, again, mainly from Russia. This was also a time when many Jews were leaving Russia and coming to the United States, as well as to Latin America and other destinations as well. This was also the time when there was a strong socialist push and the kibbutz movement. Kibbutzim are collective farms that used to be very, very common in Israel. There are still some. And the idea was creating an almost voluntary communist, socialist, agricultural or light manufacturing society that would exist on a particular farm or area. And then all the members would work together. Definitely worth reading up more about how that began. This is also the time period when the city of Tel Aviv was founded. It was nothing but sand dunes at the time. And it was also during this time period that Hebrew began to truly be revived as a spoken language. If you want to see a fascinating story, looking up how Hebrew became a spoken language through the efforts of Ben Yehuda is absolutely amazing. It's a little scary as well of what it took to make it happen, but making Hebrew into a language that was going to be spoken 24/7 by a nation was an amazing accomplishment and a miracle like none that had happened before in the history of linguistics. Languages don't come back from being not exactly dead, but from being limited to only one corner of life like this. It has never happened ever before or since. But of course, World War I happened. Now, World War I was a horrible, unmitigated disaster for the world, but it was a little bit of a silver lining for the Jewish world. Now, many, many Jews died in World War I fighting on both sides as they served as loyal members of the armies of all the different countries involved in World War I, proving, of course, that there was no such thing as a divided loyalty. But what the silver lining was is that the Ottoman Empire fell and the Ottoman Empire was taken over by the British and the French. And in particular, the area that we wished to make into our state, the area that is of Israel, fell to the British. And during the end of World War I, the British made a proclamation, a declaration that, well, let me explain. It's called the Balfour Declaration. It's at the bottom of the slide. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So what England is trying to say here is they think, yes, it would be a good thing for there to be a country that was for the Jews, that there should be a home in the land of Israel that would be a Jewish homeland. But they're also trying to say the people who currently live there that aren't Jewish, they should also not be discriminated against. And the Jews who don't live there, but who live in other countries, they should not be discriminated too. There was a very real concern that if a new state was founded, that the countries of England and France and Germany and Russia would simply push all the Jews into that new country, and that they would be ejected from other countries. And so the Balfour Declaration was trying to prevent that idea. So when England took over, they established what was called the British Mandate for Palestine. And as you can see, it covers the area that would now be considered the country of Israel and the country of Jordan. That was all part of this particular territory. Other areas had been given to other allies of the British, or to other British economic interests, or to the French. But this district was called the British Mandate for Palestine. Everyone still with me? Okay. So the third Aliyah commences after World War I finishes, 1919 to 1923. The British Mandate changes many aspects of the Aliyah. Again, about 40,000 immigrants come, mostly from Eastern Europe. And now there is more advanced work being done. This is during a period when swamps are being drained, especially up in the north, when the malaria is being fought back, when there's mass reforestation projects, with planting of trees. Israel is the only country, actually I think there was one other as well. There's one of two countries that finished the 20th century with more trees at the end of the century than at the beginning. And it was also during this time that the Haganah, the militia, was formed in order to protect the Jewish settlements and towns. And again, I apologize for racing through this. There are many, many excellent documentaries and books out there that can go into much more detail during this period. But I want you to understand at least a broad overview of the modern Israeli history. Now, after September 1922, the British make a deal with the Hashemite kingdom that they will give them the area that we now call Jordan. At the time, it was simply called Transjordan, meaning it was beyond the Jordan River. And the remainder was still considered the Palestine Mandate. So this area was given its independence under Jordanian rule, and this area was still under British control and had, of course, a very mixed population. The fourth Aliyah, from 1924 to 1929, saw another 82,000 immigrants coming, again, still from Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania especially, and this is when many small towns and light industry really become firmly established. If you go to Israel today, you can still find towns that have this very, very long history going all the way back to this time period or even before. The fifth Aliyah, well, we notice something, 250,000 new immigrants. Now, what could it be of 1929 to 1939 that is inspiring so many Jews to leave? Well, a number of things. One, the Russian Revolution has already happened at this point. Many Jews are leaving. Also, at this time, you see a rise of fascism across Europe, of course, most famously in Germany in the mid-1930s. And at that point, many Jews are beginning to feel that this is a dangerous place to live. This is also a time when many Jews wanted to come to the United States, but couldn't because of very restrictive immigration laws in the United States. So you have a huge number of Jews who are now leaving these parts of Europe and going to Israel as being one of the few places in the world that is willing to accept them. there was a general clampdown on immigration, especially of Jews, during this time period. So right before World War II, you end up with a huge influx of Jews into the land of Israel. Many of them are professionals that are coming with advanced degrees and skills and technical training as they are fleeing Germany, where they had thought that they were welcomed as part of its high culture, only to discover as the Nuremberg laws are being put into place and as Nazism is spreading more and more powerfully, that they are not welcome there anymore. So by 1940, at the beginning of World War II, there were approximately 450,000 Jews living in the Mandate for Palestine, in the area still controlled by the British. Now, in order to understand what happens next, you have to go back a little bit and look at what was happening on the Arab side, because the Arabs who lived in this period, in this place, they were responding very negatively to much of what was happening. So in 1929, there were huge Arab riots that rocked Hebron and elsewhere, that led to the deaths of many, many people, and that were begun by rumors and propaganda. In 1936 to 1939, they had what is called in history the Great Revolt, or the Great Uprising of the Arabs, which demanded independence from the UK. They said they wanted to be their own country, they wanted to be in charge for themselves, and they did not want England to be in charge of that territory anymore. Of course, independence movements were common throughout the world, and the British Empire was struggling with lots of them. The British Empire did not take kindly to these types of uprisings. And now, during the same period, many Jews were being attacked, and also many Jews were further defending themselves and strengthening their militias. Now, you may be wondering, why were Jews being attacked if they were angry at the British? Well, unfortunately, many of the people who lived in the area at the time, and to this day, saw the Jews who were living in Israel not as people returning to their homeland, but as European colonists. They saw anybody who came from Russia not as a fellow Semite who was returning to the land of their ancestors, but as a colonist. And as they established new towns and new farms, they viewed this no differently than somebody might have viewed British colonialism in Africa, in India, or any other part of the world. And so Jews were attacked as a symbol of British occupation. This revolt, however, was brutally put down by the British. It was a very, very harsh crackdown. And at the end of it, the Arab communities were very much shattered. They were in shambles. And many of the people who had been the strong secular political leaders of the Arab communities had been killed or imprisoned. And the only people the British had left more or less untouched were the religious leaders. This is one of the reasons why eventually national identity for the Palestinians begins to grow into a religious and unfortunately eventually extremist Islamic group. But when it began, it was a secular political movement. It was not a religious one. Okay, so 1937, the British are thinking, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We want to give the land to the people who are living there, but we need to be fair, which means try not to be hated by as many people as possible. And so they propose that there would be an international territory that is centered around Jerusalem with a corridor to the sea at Jaffa, which was the main port at the time along the Mediterranean, and that there would be a Jewish state in the area outlined here, and then there would be an Arab state in the remainder. The Peel Partition was the proposal by the British government, but it never was implemented or accepted by any of the participants, including the British government. It was simply a thinking proposal of what's called, a paper for consideration. But of course, World War II happened and put a stop to any British activity of governance in the area, as everyone was focused only on fighting a war. So during this time period between World War I and World War II, the British really were in a very difficult position. They were upset by the strife that came because of the mandate. They didn't really get much out of controlling this territory. It's not like the riches they were able to exploit from India or the oil they were able to exploit from other parts along the Persian Gulf, they weren't getting much out of having this tiny strip of land under their control. So they tried to limit the turmoil by limiting the number of Jews and then eventually stopping the number of Jews who were trying to come in. They thought that if they could limit or then freeze immigration, that would mean that the local Arab population would stop their uprisings. Didn't work, but that was unfortunate because now many Jews were no longer able to go there. Also, the US and other nations, as I mentioned, had very strict anti-immigration laws, and that meant that Jews generally didn't have many other options to go. And during the interwar period in particular, they were left trapped in Europe. Many Jews fought back, some of them actively, engaging in acts that we do have to admit were terrorism, but others were more passively working and trying to smuggle people as well as military equipment in order to eventually be able to secure their independence. World War II comes. Obviously, everything freezes as far as politics go. Hold on, I got a comment on the YouTube. The League of Nations had already given the land to us as a homeland, and the world agreed outside of the two countries who abstained, the US, and I do not remember a second. Yes and no. I'm responding. Someone was talking about the League of Nations. The League of Nations had authorized England to continue its role as in mandate. And although there had been discussions under such things as the Sykes-Picot Treaty and other things of establishing it, it had not actually been done in a way that was recognized as internationally binding. The League of Nations, for all of its blessed attempts, was sorely lacking in any sort of authority and was also missing numerous nations from its ranks, most notably the United States, which refused to participate even though its own president had been the one to propose it. So it's nice and unfortunately presented often as simply a fact online that we'd already been given our homeland at this time, but that simply is not the way international politics works. It makes for great Facebook posts, but with more depth, the League of Nations never established anything that was recognized by, well, practically anyone. So unfortunately, we can't really look to them. We will eventually get the United Nations, however, and that's what's going to happen in 1948. And that has a much greater power because, of course, the United Nations is actually speaking for the vast majority of the world at that time. And all of the major players and powers are in place. So we'll come back to exactly what happens with the UN in a second. But after World War II, the Holocaust, of course, had underscored the need for a Jewish homeland. Very important, however, anyone who tries to tell you that Israel was founded because of the Holocaust is missing almost 100 years worth of Zionist history. The Holocaust certainly sped up the process and showed the world, as well as other Jews who had been on the fence, that having a Jewish country was a worthwhile endeavor, but it was not the cause of that country. It also reminded us that millions who could have been saved died because they weren't allowed to go to Israel or any other country. After the war, the UK was still resisting allowing more refugees to come, even though Israel was now a prime destination for many of the people who didn't want to return to what was rising anti-Semitism as well as rising communism in Eastern Europe that would have put them under the Iron Curtain. So during this time period, about an additional 100,000 Jews were able to immigrate into the war, into Israel after the war or even during the war. So let's get now to how the United Nations. Founded at the very end of World War II, the United Nations represents all of the major powers of the world. And the British are sick and tired of being in charge of this piece of property. And so they tell the UN, you figure it out and we'll implement. So on November 29th, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly votes and 33 nations say yes, 13 nations say no, 10 nations abstain, 1 nation doesn't show up to vote, and they agree in favor of the Partition Plan, which I'll explain in just a second. This was called UN Resolution 181, and this opened the door for the state. Now, even though, as you'll see, it is not what Israel wanted, it is not what the Jews were hoping for, and in many ways it was deeply unfair, the Jews accepted the partition. They said, fine, if this is the best we can get, we'll take it. At least we have a state. As I mentioned, the pressure to be able to have your own state, to allow the refugees a place to come and be in safety, was huge at the time. So even if it wasn't ideal, they were willing to sacrifice the ideal to help their brothers and sisters. The Arabs who lived in Palestine, however, did not accept it. And the Arabs who lived in the surrounding countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, etc., they also did not accept it, even though it was passed, as you can see, by a majority of the United Nations. So what did the partition look like in the 1947 plan? Well, as you can see, we have a much larger area given as part of the Jewish state. However, larger is misleading because the area that is being given is still an area that is quite similar, with a large chunk taken out from the Peel plan. But the area that is much, much larger at the bottom is the Negev. The Negev, apart from Beersheba here on the south, was, especially at that time, mostly empty. It is still desert. It is still very sparsely populated. It is not exactly territory that anyone was fighting over getting to have, except for the question of having square miles. So really it was this area up here that was of greatest importance at the time for the Jewish people. If we look at the percentages, if we look at where the Jews lived and where the Arabs lived, you can see that in certain areas there were majority Jewish populations, and in other areas there were minority Jewish populations. And that's what these different graphs are trying to show you, to try and give you an idea of where would you draw the line and why was the line drawn the way it is. And as you can see, the Jewish population was very strong in some places, but it was very weak in some others. You can look at these three territories right here, and it should come as no surprise that these three territories, plus the area around Hebron, were at almost 100% Arab population, and those become what is now called the West Bank. So too, the tiny percentage of Jews who lived in the area that is now called Gaza. Perhaps it's a little bit easier to see the numbers by taking a look at this graph or this chart. Right, at the time of the partition in 1947, in the Arab state, the territory that had been set aside for the Arab population, there were about 725,000 Arabs living in the area and about 10,000 Jews, leading to a total of about 735,000 people. In the area that was set aside for the Jewish state, there were 407,000 Arabs and there were 498,000 Jews, which means that there was a slim Jewish majority in that area. Now, what that meant, of course, was that there was going to be a 99% Arab state and a almost 50% Arab state side by side. This was not exactly the Jewish state that the Zionists were dreaming of. This was not exactly a state with the population that would secure a future for a Jewish identity to the country. But the Jews, like I said, were willing to agree because of the importance of having a country, especially for those refugees. The international territory around Jerusalem was going to be roughly 50-50 in terms of the population, but that was going to be administered by a separate international organization. By the way, if you've never heard of that, that's because it never happened. But before we get to the war that is about to break out, let's see what the Israelis thought they were doing. This is the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to read through this abridged version very quickly. You can look up the full English translation online. Just look for Israeli Declaration of Independence. The full document is a very lovely piece of law and is very defining of what Judaism and what the Jews thought they were doing at the time. So here I go. In light of countless broken promises and continued humiliation of our people in the land of Israel by our own brothers and sisters, I would like to remind us of the principle upon which Israel was founded as recorded in her Declaration of Independence. Please read the entire document tonight and be a champion of all its goals. The land of Israel, beginning here, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave the world the eternal book of books, meaning the Bible. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient land. They made deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community, controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace, but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people, to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions. I should point out, by the way, that in 1948, this was already wildly more progressive than the United States' current laws at the time, which did not extend anything like an equality of religion, race, or sex. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally round the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the rock of Israel, meaning God, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at this session of the Provisional Council of State on the soil of the homeland in the city of Tel Aviv on this Sabbath Eve, the 5th day of ER 5708, also known as the 14th of May, 1948. So as you can see, they are founding a secular state with an acknowledgement of the deep religious roots that led to its existence. This is something that is going to become much more controversial and important as the decades of Israeli life go on. We'll talk about that a little bit at the moment, though. Theodor Herzl, when the state was being discussed, believed that there should be an arrangement among all the people who were there. And he believed that faith unites us, knowledge gives us freedom. We shall therefore prevent any theocratic tendencies from coming to the fore on the part of our priesthood. We shall keep our priests within the confines of their temples. In the same way, we shall keep our volunteer forces within the confines of their barracks. The idea being that neither the military, nor the politicians, nor the religious groups would ever be in charge of the other ones. The military wouldn't take over, and the politicians wouldn't stop the religious, and the religious would not try to have their own theocratic state. This is what eventually becomes called the status quo, a sort of détente between those who wished for a more heavily Jewish, religiously guided state and those who wished for a more secular state. You may have noticed when I went through all the different eras of immigration that the vast majority of the people who were moving there not as part of a religious ideal, but fleeing persecution. And the most prominent theology that was shared among them was not Judaism, but socialism. They were looking for a new political and economic place. They were not looking to revitalize Judaism according to the laws of halakha. That then becomes a major issue when the new state is being founded. What eventually gets settled upon by Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, is a certain compromise. So Shabbat, for example, it is clear that the legal day of rest in the Jewish state will be Shabbat, while of course allowing the members of other religions to rest on their weekly holiday. So Saturday is the day of rest in the state as a matter of state policy, much like Sunday is a day of rest in the United States. Kashrut. All necessary measures should be taken to ensure that every government kitchen which is serving Jews should have kosher food. Again, not that all food in the country has to be kosher. That was something that they opposed, but they wanted to make sure that the government at least reflected kashrut in its own cafeterias. Personal status. All members of the administration appreciate the seriousness of the problem and the major difficulties, meaning, who do you define as a Jew? Everything possible will be done to provide the deep needs of the religious, to avoid, God forbid, dividing the house of Israel into two. And in addition to defining who was a Jew, the other question was then, who gets to make Jewish marriages? Who gets to make Jewish funerals? Who gets to handle other things? This eventually continues as part of the status quo of what the British had done, which was to allow the local religious leaders, a chief rabbi or chief heads of other faiths, to be responsible for these personal status issues. Again, this has continued to be a thorny issue in Israel until now. Education. Full autonomy of each educational system will be granted and guaranteed, and the government will not violate the religious status and religious conscience of any group of Jews. The state, of course, will determine minimum obligatory courses and will supervise compliance with this minimum. So again, this is a compromise. You are allowed to have your yeshiva, we are allowed to have a secular school, but our secular school will have Jewish content, and your yeshiva will be required to have secular content. And those minimum standards are something that are still being argued about. But let's just do a quick run through of the War of 1948. And I apologize again, this deserves a great deal more attention, but I am running out of time before my next meeting. So as I mentioned, immediately after Israel's declaration of independence, it was attacked. It was formally attacked by Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Arab Liberation Army, and other volunteers. This meant that Israel was vastly outnumbered in population by the states that had declared war against it. Of course, Israel wins, or else we wouldn't be having this class in quite this way. The question then becomes, how did Israel win? Well, partly because the Arabs were disunited. No Arab group, whether it was Syria or Jordan or Egypt in particular, that were the main players, wanted the other to be the main victor. Egypt did not want Syria to take too much. Jordan didn't want Egypt to take too much. They all were hoping that they would be the ones that would get the lion's share of the land. Notice none of them were attempting to establish an independent Arab state. They were all attempting to eat part of the territory into their own state territory. They also, of course, underestimated the Israelis. They thought it was going to be a simple matter of walking in and destroying the Jewish people. It turned out that the Israelis were fighting for survival rather than territorial conquest, that the Israelis were fighting from a centralized location, which meant that they could move troops where needed from one central territory rather than having to go around the perimeter. And Israel also mobilized its whole population, whereas the Arab nations, especially at the beginning, did not commit the majority of their military force, let alone mobilizing their population. And on the whole, Israel was considered to have better equipment and better training at the time. So Israel was able at the end to end up with a different border than the 1947 partition. Again, look at this map right here, and we're going to flip forward. This was the Armistice, when in 1949, the fighting finally stopped, not a peace, but an armistice, for an agreement to stop shooting. This was the eventual border and outline. The area that's now called the West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and the area that is now called Gaza or Gaza Strip was annexed by Egypt. And the remainder of the territory became part of Israel proper. Now, in that whole territory, all of the citizens of any religion, any ethnicity, and all genders were given full equality. So Arabs who are not Jewish, and there are Jewish Arabs, by the way, that's a whole nother conversation about the Jews who lived in the Middle East, but the Muslims and Christian Arabs are given full citizenship. They are able to serve in the government. They have positions on the Supreme Court. They are given full equality under the law, as are Jews, whether they are religious, secular, or any of the many shades in between. Israel did not refuse those rights to people that did not match their hope. And at the end, it's continued to be a Jewish majority and has continued to be a Jewish majority until this day. Now, next class, we'll talk about from 1948 to the modern world. So if you're wondering what happens between then and now and what the whole issue is with Palestine and all of those topics, you're going to have to wait for next week's class. Question in chat. I believe another reason for the success of the Israelis was that American Jews that assisted the war in World War II, veterans. An example of that was many pilots in the Israeli Air Force were combat veterans that flew combat missions during World War II. Yes, as I mentioned, Israel was generally thought to have better training. A large portion of that was because of Jews who went there who had been trained in other militaries, and many of them came with veteran experience. And they passed on that experience and training to others who lived there. So absolutely, there was a big difference. And again, remember that the local Arab population had never really had as much training because in the recent decades prior to 48, because of their failed uprising against the British in the 30s. So that made a big discrepancy in the power and the competence of the armies on both sides. I should point out, however, as close as people think of the relationship between Israel and America, it was not close in 1948. It wasn't that Israel won the war because of American governmental support or even American population support. We were very fortunate, and again, there are many great stories of how it happened, to get America to vote in the United Nations for Israel at all. But you did not see America providing material support, let alone combat support. Israel stood on its own during the war of 48. And everything that it had to buy in order to resupply, it paid through the nose in order to do. Any other questions or comments in the next minute before I have to go to my next meeting? If you have other ones, you're welcome to leave them for next week, and we can always start up with a little bit of a wrap up of this session for next week's meeting. I apologize for ending abruptly, but at least we're ending on a high note of the establishment of Israel. Yay. By the way, for those who are familiar with your calendar, today is Yom Yerushalayim. We'll talk about that more next week. We talked about that also when we discussed modern holidays. Yom Yerushalayim is the day in 1967 when Jerusalem was reunified. At the end of 48, Jerusalem is a divided city, which again, we'll talk about more in the, 49, we'll talk about that more in next class. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
You have a good night.
Bye.
Okay.